Um, okay. As in, what are the causes of muscle soreness the day after you train? No worries. Okay. So remember, guys, the soreness the day after we get done training is going to be due to the damage we did to the sarcomere, the Z-line streaming, and otherwise, that in turn, the body's release what's known as inflammatory cytokine, which causes an immune response to the area, along with potassium leakage from those cells, which is in turn going to make your nerve fibers a little bit more sensitive. And that really hard, delayed onset muscle soreness, that's going to be due to, obviously, all of those components. So it's the damage we've done to the muscle fibers, which has caused inflammatory cytokines to be released, which in turn has caused an immune response to the area. So we've got a little edema and swelling, which is in turn causing our pain receptors to fire. Now, it's not due to lactate. Lactate has been cleared for probably the day before. Okay. When we get done with that training, that lactate level is going to be back to normal in at most maybe half an hour after exercise. Soreness is not due to lactate. Okay. It's not due to perhaps issues with a lack of glycogen or any other type of nutrient. It's due to the actual damage you've done to that muscle fiber. So, does that make sense to you, Holly? Anytime. You guys have questions, you want to kind of understand why the quiz questions read the way they do, or anything like that, by all means, let me know. We can always talk about these things. The goal is for you guys to be learning it. So we're going to talk about the joys of training, how we're really trying to optimize our training in ways so that we're going to be able to make the greatest progress we can without obviously hurting ourselves or otherwise. Now, at certain points, we're going to do what's known as overreaching, so applying stress faster than our body can recover from it. And like anything else, there is no, there essentially is hardly any limit to how much training you can do in a day. However, there is a limit in how much training you can recover from. So anytime that you do way more work than your body can recover from, well, you're going to have delayed training responses. You might possibly obviously get injured, or you're obviously never going to actually get better from that training. And if we do excessively hard training for very long periods of time and don't give our body time to recover like it needs, congratulations, now you're working your way into what's known as overtraining. And that is a great way to have lots of aches and pains. And then there's two different iterations of that, where one effectively takes months to resolve, possibly even a year to go back to your previous levels. And the other is you never actually go back to those previous levels. So that is sad. Now we are going to talk about tapering, which is going to be choosing to decrease how much work we're doing for a week or two, maybe even 3 in certain cases. So we're going to be able to go ahead and get ourselves essentially damaged in a way, or recovered from that damage in a way that we're going to perform even better than we would have otherwise, because fatigue masks fitness. And then obviously detraining, where we're just not doing as much. And then over a longer period of time, we're going to keep going back and back. Or as I like to call it, my patented 5K to couch program. All you have to do is be in 5K shape and then quit working out. You'll be back to being only sedentary and on the couch within a couple months. So do less, feel worse. Is it pretty tough to achieve overtraining? That is a great question. The answer to that is, like most things, it depends. Psychologically, and we're kind of jumping a little bit ahead here, you are going to naturally not really be interested in training, or not, you're going to, stomp on the gas pedal and try to push yourself, and you're not going to feel like you're able to. And that's going to be effectively your psychological feedback mechanism that typically is going to get most people to stop, or at least not push themselves to the point where they're going to fall apart. Now, some people that are very type A, psychologically insane, maybe very self-abusive psychologically, they're going to potentially be able to drive themselves into overtraining potentially, because they have that ability to just keep smashing their way forward, even though they're not making any progress, they're only getting worse. Now, if you are a bad coach working with athletes and overtraining them, that's where you're in that situation where you can much more easily. In fact, there's some interesting literature, and of course, I'm doing a poor job of recalling the name. You guys can feel free to obviously put the name up, and when this gets posted on YouTube, post it there, which is a number of Olympic athletes, when asked if they were overtrained or overreached, and it was crazy. It was something like 70% of them it was a pretty high fraction of Olympic athletes, which in theory have the best coaches in their country to prepare them. And a lot of them complained about being overtrained or they were overreached. So they were doing too much. And because of this, they performed worse than they would have otherwise. So it's a weird thing to talk about overtraining. Most people don't have to worry about overtraining. They need to worry about just training. But if you're working with people that, you know, they've got a high level of dedication and they're really willing to put in obviously a whole lot of work, you can have that potential issue. That is actually going to be overreaching when we're starting to have a regression. Now, overreaching, and this is nice because we're kind of jumping ahead here, it comes in two different flavors. You've got functional overreaching, which is a normal thing to do with athletes of at least like an intermediate or advanced caliber, because we're literally going to train them so hard in certain points that they are going to actually have a slightly lower than normal performance, with the idea that we then give them that taper, that deload, and they're going to super compensate. So when we're normal, when we're not normal, when we're just starting off training, we apply a little bit of stress, get a little bit weaker, and then we get stronger. And we just keep doing that and stair step it for as long as it handles. That's where linear periodization works really well in ranked beginners. But as you work your way up to higher potential or higher fractions of your genetic potential, you need to have certain periods of time where you really induce fatigue, like you really are performing with, you know, maybe a 5 to even 10% decrement of your normal performance. So that way you can then cut back your training volume and then you can super compensate and shoot above. And that's what some is functional overreaching. Non-functional overreaching is doing the same thing, only when you cut back the training, congratulations, you just got back to where you started. So you got really tired for nothing. Ugh, not a great way to be. Now, the overtraining is even further into that non-functional overreaching. And now we're talking about months, maybe even a year to get back to where we were before, or we never get back there again. We've now done damage to these tissues in ways that they're never going to be able to remodel in such a way that you're going to be able to perform on the same level that you were ever before. So does that make sense as far as what is the difference between overtraining and overreaching? We're going to touch on that again in a few, but it is important to understand, you know, the basics of anything. Like we're talking about those 5 basic principles of training. There should be progression. If we're not making progress, what are we doing? You know, why? Now, part of the reason why you might not be making progress on a program is we're not doing enough to disrupt homeostasis anymore. So whenever we're working out, those type of stresses are what's known as hormetic stressors. So we apply stress to the body and then we get better at it. So the next time that stress is applied, we're now a little bit more resilient, a little bit more robust. We're not going to be, you know, effectively as messed up from it. So this is not just for lifting weights, but think about things like a tan, where if you go out in the sun, you walk around for a while, you can get a little bit of sunburn or worse, obviously, if you're out there for too long. What's your body do to help try to avoid this? Well, you start to get a tan. So like anything else, you'll be out in the sun a little bit, and then you can be out in the sun a little bit longer once your skin starts to darken a little bit, and you can keep going and going and going. So a lot of the beginning of our progress in overtraining, really is neurological changes. And then after that, it's hypertrophy, which is hard fought. It takes a long time to really increase muscle mass to appreciable amounts. And so like anything else, this is a positive stress. However, if we were to apply too much of the positive stress, we get to that hormetic, and that's where we're talking about sunburns. That's where we're talking about not building calluses on our hand, but blisters and or just ripping skin off. So like anything else, we want to make sure we're only applying as much as we need to in order to make that progress. Now, we talked about individuality. Some individuals are going to be able to adapt far faster than others. And like anything else, we want to apply as much stress to get that optimal increase in performance. So the easiest way to kind of draw the graph here, guys, when we're talking about here's your performance level, this is your baseline. Now, this is just the idea of effectively how much volume we're doing, okay? So over here, we've got volume, and this is why me drawing left-handed. And this is going to be our delta, meaning our change, okay? What you're gonna find is it's gonna have a relationship like this. So we can do crazy, stupid amounts of volume, and we can just absolutely demolish ourselves. Somewhere in each training session is the optimal amount of work to do, okay? There's also the minimal effective dose, And then there's the point at which where we've done so much work that it's going to take so long for our body to recover from that work that congratulations. Once again, you've made yourself really tired, but you haven't really made that much progress. Now, your goal with anybody you work with is to find this spot and also this one. So what's the minimal amount of work we can do and still make some progress? And then what's the optimal amount of we can do that we can make the best progress? Who cares about being over on this side of the tail? Because now we're putting in more work than we would need to just make obviously less than optimal progress. And unfortunately, this is thanks to who your mommy and daddy are and what's going on with your previous training session or training history and how everything comes together. So if we're going to do a lot of volume, we can't really do as high of intensity. And if we're going to do really high intensity, we're not going to be doing as much volume. Now, intensities, think of it as percentages of your maximum. So think max speed, max strength, max power, etc. And volume is literally how much work you're doing. So let's say today we're going to have everybody go in and do 100 total reps at 20% of their back squat max. Whatever. A number of people could just do all those 100 reps in one set. Some folks would barely be out of breath. Now, if we had you do 100 total reps at 50% of your max, okay, that's a lot of volume. The loads, depending on how strong you are not a joke. However, still not really that brutal on the body. Now, if we had you come in and you have to do 100 total reps at 90% of your max, oh, sweet Jesus. Like, some people might be bleeding, some people might pass out, maybe a couple of people get rhabdomyolysis. Like anything else, we have to be mindful of how much work we're asking people to do. And obviously, if we're doing way more than we should for far too long, that's where we talk about overtraining, where you're talking about fatigue, illness, overuse, injuries, so damage to those tissues. And think about different sports. How many different sports literally have an injury named for participating in it or after a famous athlete that played it because of what had to get repaired? So if we're doing a good job with any of our training, our tissues are getting stronger. They're getting thicker. They're going to be able to tolerate more damage. Like we talked about the specificity on in-person lab last Friday. So you want to make sure we're adapting in a positive way. If your athletes are going to Snap City, we're applying too much work that we're not able to recover from it in the period of time that we need to. So remember, we have to have some form of progressive overload. This could be increasing the amount of work we're doing. So the total amount of reps we're getting in. This could be increasing the intensity, so the percentage of max we're working at. This could be decreasing our rest period. We've got a lot of different, and then obviously combinations of those, okay? And that's going to allow us to help make progress. Now, undertraining is when we're not doing as much work, and that's going to be that beginning of the curve where we're not really making as much progress. And one of the most vicious parts of as you get to be in better and better shape, you typically do need to do more and more work to still make progress. And if anything else, if you make your make your program easier for too long, you're actually going to start to go backwards. And this is what's known as undertraining. So because of this, we're not going to be able to perform as well as possible. This is not the same as deloading, okay, or tapering. This is going to be undertraining. So long periods of time where we're not doing as much. And this is a major issue with a lot of sport teams because in season, you naturally don't want to be lifting weights as much. You've got a lot of stress of playing the sport, traveling for it, depending on the level you're playing and everything else. However, if we just don't lift weights anymore, now we're really going to be undertraining and we can pretty much expect our muscle mass, our strength, our power to all go backwards, which is a really big deal because now we can massively increase our risk of injuries because it turns out we're not taking care of trying to balance our physique and decrease injury risk for movement patterns or otherwise that tend to be more problematic with the sport. And yes, we can always do more work. The first thing you can do to help avoid overtraining is don't. Don't worry about trying to recover from overtraining, just don't do it. So, undertraining, where we're not doing enough work, so we're not really going to be making a lot of performance. And one thing to keep in mind with undertraining is think of it along the lines of not necessarily undertraining everything. You can be undertraining maybe one modality or one component of performance. So you're undertraining strength for a little bit. So you're just not putting as much emphasis there, but maybe you're really focusing on endurance. Maybe you're focusing on power. maybe you're focusing on speed. Now, acute overload is that single daily training session. That's going to be the one that's going to cause some positive changes. They're going to be challenging. We're going to be a little beat up. We're definitely going to be fatigued on the far side. Then we get into overreaching. And this is where we're going to be not just decline our performance, but then that's where you're talking about the delayed onset muscle soreness, and otherwise your performance is going to be lower in subsequent bouts for the rest of that week. So you're going to need more time to come back for it. Now, this is where we want to live. Now, when we do more overreaching and getting to that non-functional overreaching than overtraining, congratulations. You've done so much work that your body cannot recover from it. And now, because of this damage, you're going to be obviously far less comfortable. And if anything, congratulations, your performance is now going down. So acute overload, overreaching, and functional overreaching, absolutely fine. When we start going even further into the stress, into non-functional overreaching and overtraining, congratulations, you're doing a lot of work to go backwards. Not a good time. So you do not want to be forcing yourself into overreaching for more than, say, maybe a week, perhaps two. So this would be like a really hard training camp or something like a really hard push before the end of the season. And then you hit your taper. You take back your volume, you take back your intensity, so you allow your body to completely resolve all of that damage you've done during this period of time. Now, if we keep overreaching, and this can be week after week, month after month, this can be a problem. That's what we're getting into, obviously, overtraining. We're not going to make the progress anymore. Now, the other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about overreaching and what we'll be getting to in a moment with excessive training is, remember, each person can only recover from so much work. Some athletes naturally can tolerate far higher work volumes and need far higher work volumes in order to make progress. Some athletes need far less volume in order to make progress. And if you're one of those athletes, if you try to follow that really high volume program, congratulations, you're just going to get hurt and you're possibly going to go backwards. And you could do far less training and make just as much progress. So it's important to learn yourself. And then when we are working with groups, understanding you're going to have a wide variety of effects on how quickly people are going to recover. And in fact, we're going to touch briefly on it right now. Recovery is obviously all the things you're doing when you're not inside of the gym. Now, what are going to be the two most potent things that you can do when it comes to helping yourself recover from the training and exercise that you do? What are the two most effective things you can do? Sleep is absolutely going to be number one. And then nutrition. So Courtney, definitely not wrong with talking about hydration, but it's definitely going to be eat well. Now, if we know sleep and nutrition are going to be the top two things we can do for recovery, Abby and Colleen, I'm probably going to pick on you guys. Not pick on you guys, but really it's more pick on your teammates. How many of you guys, and this is a pretty simple thing, sleep more, eat a healthy diet, make sure you're fueling yourself appropriately. How many of your teammates don't do that? Seeing as how neither of them are responding to me, that's fine. I'll go ahead and that's fine. It can be hard. No, it's okay. I appreciate you guys typing that in there. Where it's can be difficult to make sure that you're eating an adequate amount of calories, especially when you guys are in a high volume phase. And yes, you guys are college students that are in a major and in a class that is pretty demanding of you. So you've got a lot of work to do, which is naturally going to take away from the period of time that you have to sleep. If, we talk about priorities, and obviously I don't know everything else that's going on in your life. So you can have issues with, on a given team, most of the athletes are doing well on your training program, except for one or two. And the reason for it is because they're not sleeping. Like they've got all these other things going on in the classrooms, in their social life, in their families that are stressing them, that in turn, you are just another, you're the next straw that's going to break the camel's back. And so it's important when we're thinking about overreaching, we also need to think about under recovery, because that's very easy to do. That is a great thing to hear, because that is a great place to start. And that's the easiest way, the cheapest way to improve it. I had a cheerleader that I was working with. It was when I was helping coach more with the cheerleading team. And one of them's like, yeah, I'm having a hard time recovering. I'm thinking about doing one of those cryo tank things, like you pay a lot of money to go freeze in a liquid nitrogen room, which, does have some potential positive effects on signaling and otherwise. And I was like, how many hours you sleep in a night? They're like, I'm getting like 4 hours. I'm like, well, there's one thing we can work on. And I was like, well, how much, what have you had to eat today? And this is like 4 or 5 in the afternoon. They already had a morning practice. Like, I've had like a Monster Energy drink and a Pop-Tart. Oh, meh. I think I know why you don't feel like you're recovering well enough from your training. So keep in mind, it's always a balance, guys. It's always a balance. So what does this mean outside of working with athletes? When we're just working with normal people, when we think about recovery compared to training stimulus, what do we want to think about when we're applying this? No worries, Courtney. When it comes to just working with normal people, and yes, non-athletes, why do we care about the concept of how much stress we're applying and how much recovery that they're capable of? Exactly. Because your body has a finite ability to recover from stress. So if you're currently working 40 plus hours a week, bingo, you've got maybe a new baby that's not sleeping, you've got X number of other stressors going on in your life. So trying to go whole ham, lifting weights is probably going to be that extra amount of stress. If your recovery is here and we're still trying to stress ourselves here, that's a recipe for disaster. So in those periods of time when you're not getting as much sleep and everything else, that's when we got to bring down the rest of the stressors in life that we can. And obviously, one of the things that we can control is training stress. So during those periods of time, yourself, your clients, your patients, your subjects, etc., that's where it's time to cut back, do less work in the gym, maybe take a little time off from the gym. Maybe instead of training 2, 3, 4 times per week, we bring that down just once or twice. Something where, like, yes, they still get to work out. They're going to probably maintain a lot of their performance changes, but we're not being another major stressor they need to recover from. So excessive training, folks, is just obviously doing far too much volume and intensity. Now, in the like 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on, more back in the day, a lot of folks weren't really doing that much work when it comes to training. So they found when they increased their total training volume, so their performance. But like that curve I showed you guys earlier, at a certain point, you're going to start to go backwards. So obviously the example here was from a swimming research study where literally the athletes that swam 3 to 4 hours per day compared to the athletes that only did an hour and a half had the exact same changes in performance. So even though they were in the pool for literally twice as long as the other group, they were not making twice as much progress, much less were they making any better progress that it was even worth it. So we want to avoid what's known as junk volume. So doing work because we can do work, which in turn is actually not making us any better. So there's nothing wrong with when an athlete has gotten to the point where they need to train twice per day in order to get better. But that's going to be relatively rare. And now we're talking about obviously elite level individuals. So just because we can train more frequently doesn't mean we should. Now, the only other time that I could see a possible use for this, but even then it's probably not going to be very sustainable, which is if we're trying to aggressively do some weight loss to where, yes, If you're trying to lose weight, we need to be in a caloric deficit. If you're training more times per day, you're going to be in a bigger deficit. With the basic assumption, you're not massively upticking your caloric intake, so you're offsetting it. So instead, let's focus on getting in high quality work, seeing how the body adapts to that training, and then we can always add a little bit more volume if we are, and this is why you talk with your athletes, because soreness is not always the best indicator of you've made, progress. Like anyone can make themselves incredibly sore. Oh, sorry. I just saw your comment there, Colleen. Okay. The comment is awesome. Is that like the kids that are always in the gym and are still trash at their sport? It can be. Yeah, it can be. Folks that are doing a whole lot of work and going nowhere. And, therein lies part of the, success leaves clues. That's why a lot of athletes, if you look at, large swaths of successful athletes in a given sport, they all tend to train very close to being the same way. So it's highly unlikely that everybody there is training poorly and you're the one person that knows what's going on. So the other thing to keep in mind when we're looking at anyone, and this is where it's called availability heuristics, and then sometimes we're talking about appeals to tradition otherwise, where like, oh well, so and so did this and look at how they are. Well, you're not so and so. So instead, think about what are they doing on average, and then also think about what they're doing on average when they were at your point in the sport. So let's talk about Abby and Colleen. Do you mind ballparking me how many how many miles per week you guys are running? Okay. So Abby's 40 to 45, Colleen's about 25. Now, highest on the team is like 67. Perfect. Okay, so we got, notice some variance right there in Division I distance runners, okay? Now, if you guys can think back, okay, obviously this is a long time ago, when you guys were first getting into cross country, or just, distance running and everything else, how many miles were you guys doing per week? Yeah, don't get me wrong. Yeah, different points in time, different ages and everything else. And now this is running, for those of you guys looking in the chat, this is not including them walking around campus. This is not including all the other physical activity they get from just moving around. This is just the actual deliberate sport practice. So, starting off with effectively half the volume that you guys are currently at now, and I'm sure some folks it's even less than half if you guys really had like great records of where you started. So over time, you build up that volume. Over time, you get to the point where you're doing all that work. So yeah, my God. And I really, again, appreciate you putting that comment out there, Colleen, because I'm going to kind of be in rant mode for a little bit. I don't know this person's name. I'll probably learn it at some point. But so myself and my training partners, we've been working out on occasion over the campus rec. And there's this kid, and I say kid, he's a college student. And in the same period, it took me and my training partners, three of us, to get through effectively usually 4 to 6 exercises. This person is still working on the first exercise. Now, this is pretentious, okay? This is unfair. I don't know his story and everything else, but I will tell you this. Every single set he does, he videos, and seemingly after every video, every set, he needs to watch that video and then scroll through Instagram, and then 3 to 5 minutes later, he will do his next set. The weights that he's moving are usually my second to third warm-up set. At no point in my training career have I ever trained that slowly, much less worked out with anyone that trains that slowly. The only time I can think of, I'd say he goes about, I'd say put him about 5'10", 150 pounds, maybe. Maybe. And obviously this person is in the gym because they want to make progress, because they want to get strong. I mean, Lord knows, they've got all the belts and wrist wraps and all the other bells and whistles that, it's what you're supposed to do. The fun thing is wrist wraps were originally from weightlifting, because those guys would be cleaning and jerking like 400 pounds. And that's, or, 300 pounds, something that's more like 1.5 times to 2 times body weight. Like, it is really uncomfortable sometimes to catch those weights. Power lifters started using them more when the bench shirt came around. So all of a sudden they were able to bench press literally 100 pounds more than how much they could handle. I'm kind of afraid of the average like wrist integrity of the college guy, because they got to use wrist wraps to curl like 30-pound dumbbells and press like 200 pounds. Like, I've never had to use wrist wraps, and don't get me wrong, I was never a 400-pound bench presser. Best I ever hit was 365, but somehow mine can hang in there. But getting back to trying to be positive about all this, the person's doing all this work and not really making much progress. And that could be due to a lack of intensity, or it could be just due to excessive volume, given where they're at, essentially with their training. Well, you can buy Swole. It's called steroids. They really freaking work, but we'll get there in a future lecture. And if this gentleman is on steroids, I would ask that he tries to get his money back. So, and once again, the key is to just do enough work to make yourself get better. So if I was going to try to pick up long distance running, and I told Abby and Colleen that I want to run with them, I would run with them maybe once a week, and I would try to run with them on their like long, slow distance day, with the intent of just trying to hold on for however long I made it. Could be 1 mile, could be 100 yards, whatever, but not having the expectation that I'm going to come in and do the amount of work that they do, because I will get buried. And the same would be true if, you guys want to lift weights with me. You're more than welcome to. I will never expect you guys to use the same weights as me, much less do the same amount of volume. I'm in a different place physiologically than a lot of other people, and that's absolutely fine. The key is, once again, we need to be doing only the amount of volume we need in order to make progress. So we can always do more, but it doesn't mean it's be productive. Yeah, it turns out you're running for a very good program. So absolutely. Yes, I've seen how fast your guys run, and I've seen how fast you guys run. I don't think I'm going to hold on for very much long with your guys. Long, slow distance is my pitting it, like max speed, probably very much so. RER is over 1, but sometimes you got to humble yourself. So the amount of work we're doing should always be sport specific. So we need to keep in mind, how much work do we really need to do to play our sport? So like anything else, if we don't really do that much work in the sport, why are we doing that much volume? We can always do more, but let's ask ourselves why. Now, for cross country, track and field, we know the distances we need to cover. Now, you need to do more than just run a 5K once per week, or a 10K or a 15, whatever event you're competing. But if you're training for a 15K, you don't need to do the same volume as a marathon runner. You're not going that far, and you're definitely going faster relative to your own performance. Now, on the flip side of this, think about sports. How far is your average soccer player running in a game? Throw out a guess for me, guys. How far do you think your average soccer player is running in a game? Nice, guys. Now, the first thing it comes down to is, what position are we talking about? So midfielders, it's not unheard of for those folks. It is a lot of stop and go, which is actually harder, because you have to stop, change direction, and go. It's not as efficient as just staying moving the entire time. You'll have midfielders in certain like pro level matches that are running over 10 miles over the course of a 90-minute game, plus the warm up beforehand. Now you have goalies that probably cumulatively, if their team's doing well, don't even run 100 yards. Then you've got your defenders and your offenders that can easily be usually around The 5 to 6 spread was actually a good choice there. That's gonna be about your average, but then obviously some games can be way more than that because there's just a lot of action over on your side of the field, and then there'll be other games that'll be less. So that doesn't necessarily mean we need to go out and run 20 miles every single practice. So, the games are going to be easy, but instead keeping in mind, like, yeah, you got to be able to run if you're going to go play soccer, like for decent distances, because it is just part of the sport. Now, if we're looking at a sport like softball, baseball, and you're just a first base or third base person, then turns out you probably don't have to run that much in the given game. And especially if you're, for the hitting side, yeah, you got to do some sprinting, but your total yardage, your total volume isn't going to be that high. So we need to keep in mind, like, okay, how far are we going? How much do we really need to do? That's going to be appropriate for that given sport. And we talked a little about specificity and modality and otherwise, like the blocking sleds for the linemen in order to help develop the more specific energy systems. So hence, if we're doing more total work, our intensity should be lower, and then vice versa. If we're trying to hit them both with both at the same time, congratulations, we're going to have ourselves some issues. And like anything else, what we're emphasizing is going to give us different results. If we're trying to be better at sprinting, well, the effects that we're going to get are going to obviously be different than if we're trying to get better at long distance running. And that's why the world's best marathoner and the world's best sprinter are not going to match up, much less the world's best 400-meter runner is not going to be able to match up too well against the world's best 100-meter. Now, overtraining is where we have what we call an unexplained decrease in performance for weeks, months, and even potentially years. Now, this is not going to be fixed by simply taking a deload, by doing a hard taper. We've done so much negative or so much overstressing in the body that this is where we're talking about psychological burnout, where people are like, I don't want to do the sport anymore. I don't want to play anymore. I don't like this. And obviously the physiological issues to different systems. This can happen due to resistance training. This can happen due to anaerobic style power sports. This can be happening due to aerobic endurance sports. Now, not all of doing fatiguing work is going to cause overtraining. The key is excessive work for long periods of time is going to put us on that path there if we're not careful. And so everyone's going to have an off day. Everyone's going to have a time they don't feel like it. They're going to be tired, etc. But the key is to know your body, see what you can actually recover from, and then worry about, bringing this up or down appropriately wherever we're at. So overtraining syndrome itself is obviously going to be very much so based upon the individual. It's going to be relatively subjective. So it's not straightforward of like, oh, I'm so overtrained, I need time off. No, it can be very different. Now, straightforward, the first things that are going to go down is your peak power. So like things like your vertical jump and your desire to train. Then it's going to show itself as decrements in strength, coordination, overall endurance capacity. Endurance athletes, we're going to talk about the different types of the autonomic system that are touched in a bit, but it becomes an issue. Being tired, being hungry all the time or not being hungry at all, not being able to sleep, having issues with mood, and then, just not being as into it as you once were. Like the body, when it's doing way more work than it's supposed to, is going to naturally try to disincentivize you from doing more work because obviously it doesn't want you to hurt yourself. So it's gonna be like, no, we should back this down some. Like it's going to make sure that in theory, you're never doing more than your body can actually handle. Now, when we say it can be intensity or volume related, it's usually a combination of the two, but if it's more volume related, that's typically going to be more parasympathetic overtraining, and that's usually something that happens more from long distance running. Whereas if it happens to be really intensity based from doing too much high intensity work all the time, that's going to be more sympathetic overtraining. And so it can literally start to chip away at athletes and make it so they no longer want to do this anymore. So what we have here, guys, is going to be performance, the baseline, stress, you allow yourself to recover, make progress, recover, make progress, recover, make progress. This is normal, appropriate overload and overreaching, okay? Over here, this is non-functional overreaching and more, this is true overtraining, where we apply stress, we get a little bit better, but then we apply more stress, and then we actually don't even get back to our previous baseline. Then we apply more stress and we go down again and go down again, okay? Now, this is going to have negative effects on our testosterone levels, increasing our cortisol levels, and a number of other endocrine issues, sometimes suppressing thyroid hormone function and decreasing your immune system functioning, which can obviously lead to more illnesses. And like anything else, it can be relatively difficult to diagnose if you're not doing a good job of managing your athletes and looking for their natural daily fluctuations, even monthly fluctuations, especially if you're working with more female athletes. So you're really getting an idea of, are we trending in the right direction? And that's where having some good empirical evidence, so this can be tracking mood over longer periods of time, like using wellness surveys and otherwise can be useful, or tracking performance, things like vertical jump over long periods of time, and making sure that we're at least maintaining our performance, if not increasing our performance, because if our performance is going down, that's going to be a straightforward red flag that congratulations, we're doing more than the athlete can recover from. So the sympathetic overtraining, mostly due to really heavy resistance training, strength power work. We're talking about increased blood pressure, not as hungry, losing weight, issues with falling asleep, kind of insomnia and otherwise, and emotional disturbances, and then an actually increased basal metabolic rate. Now, this doesn't mean they won't necessarily have issues with gaining weight potentially, but this is kind of more of like your typical situations you're going to find here. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system responses, and once again, this is more of a major volume thing, we're talking about fatigue, not just lower resting heart rate and blood pressure, but also not able to get our heart rate as high and heart rate recovering rapidly. This can also be related to not just fatigue, but also going to find issues with weight gain. So athletes keep gaining weight, regardless what they do, because they've once again overstressed their body. And that's why it's so important to individualize your training loads, understanding if we're doing too much, we can have some major issues. So you see how decreased percentage-wise for testosterone and thyroxine, remember that's going to be our thyroid hormone, or T3, and then our cortisol, that major stress hormone, is going to be higher. So hence the testosterone to cortisol ratio is a great indicator of effectively how hard we're stressing these athletes and are we recovering well enough. So if we happen to be getting this ratio further and further off, congratulations, we now have more catabolism and less anabolism. So over a longer period of time, we're decreasing our muscle mass. So it's going to be excess volume. That's typically going to be the one that's more likely to affect these hormones. And it turns out it happens all the time. You're going to see the type of hormonal suppression in individuals like in the special forces and those type of communities where their training is going to be insanely brutal on the body. So they're typically going to be incredibly suppressed, and far more than just 10 to 20%, but far, far greater, because of obviously the lack of sleep, the lack of appropriate nutrition, and applying more training stimuli than the body can go ahead and respond to. Now, blood urea concentrations, we're talking about breaking down protein more, greater amounts of catecholamines, the epinephrine, norepinephrine, hence why it's harder to sleep. And like anything else, the amount of time we're doing between our training sessions, blood biomarkers aren't necessarily the best thing. That's why looking at enthusiasm in the training, looking at power outputs is really useful. And obviously it's going to be causing issues with our hormonal cascade. So we can have issues with not just our adrenal glands through the sympathetic side, but we can also have through our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortical, so that's increasing our cortisol from our adrenal glands, as well as we can be obviously suppressing our own natural sex hormones. When it comes to issues with our immune response, now we talked about earlier those cytokines that are going to go ahead and be released in response to effectively the inflammation that you've done from the damage to your tissues. Well, this in turn is going to cause a greater amount of in general systemic inflammation. So now the rest of the body is going to start to get to be a bit inflamed. And because of this, we are not going to be recovering as well as we would have otherwise. So you guys can see how we have these natural flow charts and also a bit of negative feedback here when it comes to interleukin-1, IL-6, and I believe it's also tumor TNF alpha, tumor necrotic factor alpha. So in turn, all of these different hormones are going to be effectively causing issues with downregulating our actual immune system, so we're more likely to actually get sick. So what you find is this very interesting relationship, which is If you are just moderately, you're exercising frequently, you're in decent condition, you're non-sedentary, you're going to actually see an increase in overall immune system functioning. And notice these graphs aren't necessarily perfect. In fact, I think they're going to be even more enhanced. We're going to keep learning when it comes to the interaction of the immune system and exercise. But once we go into overtraining and exhaustive exercise, this is where we are going to much more decrease our immune function and in turn increase our disease susceptibility. So yes, exercise does improve your immune system until we're doing excessive exercise. So when some folks were getting a little highfalutin about this during the beginning of the pandemic and being like, exercise is keeping people safe. Well, yes, and potentially no, depending on how much exercise they're having them do. And if you're someone who's crying from the rooftops saying that we need to go train harder, I imagine you see this quite frequently. So you might actually be overstressing your people so their immune system is going to be weaker. But whatever, it's just science. It doesn't care about how you feel, but we need to worry about your feelings, right? So do keep in mind, guys, like anything else, the body can only recover from a finite amount of stress. So the most important thing of your body in the acute is to survive your training. Your body doesn't know you're training. Your body just knows there's something going on and it is incredibly energetically demanding to our muscles. We're doing some damage to our joints and tendons and our bones. Like, we need to be ready for this. And it's not going to prioritize the little bit of viruses or bacteria inside of you because it's trying to make sure you're not turning into something's meal. And it'll take care of the immune system fighting that a little bit harder later. It's more about just surviving right now, not thinking about the effects of what 10, 20, 30 years of poor decisions are going to make. So, like anything else, just keep in mind what your body is going to be able to tolerate and how well you're going to be able to tolerate it. So some folks, once again, can deal with much higher volumes, and it's typically going to be due to how much volume they're used to. One thing to keep in mind is what's known as the acute to chronic training ratio, which is, it's a simple mathematical way to look at how much work you do over a given week and then compare that over how much work you do over a given, on average per week over a month. And anytime you tend to increase that volume by effectively over 25%, it seems to show a massive uptick in your risk of injury, which makes perfect sense. If you've gone from running 5 miles a day to now you're going to try to do 10 miles a day, you're really increasing your risk of getting hurt. It's originally from rugby athletes, and just looking at total training volume they were doing there. So it's already a sport that involves collisions. But keep in mind, we can only adapt to so much volume at once. And if we try to really increase the amount of volume we're dealing with, we can obviously massively uptick our risk of injuries. So it is fascinating that overtraining syndrome, fibromyalgia, and chronic fatigue all are relatively similar as far as what's going on with the body. Not fully understanding what's going on could be downregulation of beta adrenergic receptors, could be downregulation of a lot of different other signaling pathways in the body as a way to effectively avoid further damage. But definitely, you're going to be fatigued, psychologically not going to be obviously as into it, and then a number of other endocrine, neural, and just overall immune dysfunction that can occur. So what we have here is, as we're going from trained to overtrained to undertrained, so when we are untrained. So we got untrained to trained. Notice your heart rate's going to be a little bit lower when you're doing that same mile run, but as we're doing more volume the body can tolerate, your heart rate's going to be higher, but your performance will not be as great. So having more metrics that you can then follow and link and see how performance works is going to be really important for avoiding this and making sure that we're training optimally. So we're going to call it here. What questions, comments, concerns otherwise that can I cover with you guys right now before we go ahead and wrap for the day? The lab this week is going to be the lactate, which unfortunately we still, thanks to supply chains, do not have more lactate strips. If those come in sometime soon, then we can definitely go ahead and have somebody go and pilot it. Otherwise, there is the video in the 2020 labs that you can watch, and that's more blood glucose, and look at the miserable effects of me doing yet another Wingate because I am no stranger to pain. Any other questions, comments, concerns before we go ahead and call it a day, guys? I appreciate that, Colleen. Like I said, unfortunately, this is actually the tube that the lactate strips come in, and we are so if I can get some more in here, we will definitely look into having you ride the pain train to nowhere. There is one of the other big things, and great job again doing the VO2 max this past week. We do want to do these tests, but we want to make sure we're only doing them correctly. Don't want people to risk their health, which, don't get me wrong, the risk of the health is relatively low when you're doing things correctly, but we're not going to have people risk their health or at least put forth those efforts if we're not able to at least get some data from it and make sure we're getting the data appropriately. So stay safe out there, guys. Thank you guys for listening as always, and I will see you guys on Wednesday. Bye-bye.